Juniors, I just finished posting the Introduction to Philosophy course, or the first lecture for Intro to Philosophy, Western Philosophy, and now I have a brief summary of Advanced Logic. Now, the first unit that we're doing here is really just an overview of the introductory logic course that we teach at school, which is on Aristotelian logic, or an Aristotelian interpretation of categorical logic. And so in theory, this is really all going to be a review, which is why we're flying over a lot of it relatively quickly. Now, I know not all of you have had logic before, and so this is going to require much more focused attention. And that's fine. Please come to me and talk to me if this is extremely difficult for you, or even just moderately, like it's not quite clicking. The reason we're kind of going to gallop at such a fast pace is because I'm going to assume that, at least for most of you, much of this is review. That does not mean that you have immediate recall to it, right? It might mean that you have to really examine and kind of dig up the review, but nonetheless. I have already warned you that there is a difference of categorical logics that's important to note. We have traditional Aristotelian logic, which I refer to as the Aristotelian interpretation of categorical logic, and then we have more of a contemporary categorical logic as well. Now, the difference of them is relatively minor. The book that you have is going to take a contemporary point of view, whereas what you've done in the past is Aristotelian by nature. The biggest difference between the two of them is a fundamental assumption, which is that in Aristotelian logic, you cannot have an empty set. And by an empty set, I mean a category which doesn't refer to anything in a syllogism. Meanwhile, in contemporary categorical logic, they will allow for the possibility of empty sets. That is, terms that don't actually refer to anything that exists in the real world. That may sound rather pedantic, but it does actually have far-reaching implications for other strategies that you're going to implement, especially what is referred to as the star theory, or the star strategy for determining the validity of an argument, which Gensler uses in his book that we're using for the course. So I put a little pin in that to say I'm going to now go through Aristotelian categorical logic, or the Aristotelian interpretation, but that's not actually what we're using for this course. Most of the time we're going to be using more of a contemporary approach, and so this is really to give you a brief running start that should be familiar in order to then facilitate the difference, or make the differences clearer later on. Already I've been using vocabulary like terms, and this is really the fundamental thing that we're trying to do in categorical logic, is we're working with the smallest unit of logic. And there's two ways of interpreting that. One of the smallest unit could be operators, right? Words like and, or, not, or it is not the case. These are what we call logical operators. And in propositional logic, those are typically seen as the smallest units. But there's another source that we can understand as the smallest unit, and these are the terms that we're referring to. In categorical logic, we're trying to get two categories of things, and these could be broad categories that include a lot of things, or they can be reduced down all the way to an individual level. And we're trying to say how one category tells us something about another category, right? It might not necessarily be something that we don't know, but at very least, those two categories are going to have some sort of relation with one another. So what do I mean by that? Well, a category could be something like dogs, or furniture, or it could be something like Fido the dog, or the chair that I'm sitting on right now. Okay. In the former instances, I'm using a broader category, ones that may have a longer specification of species underneath that broader category, right? Furniture is a large category that includes things like chairs, desks, lamps, and all that kind of stuff. Even further, I could talk about tables, and I could talk about different types of tables, like coffee tables, or dining room tables, or the table that we have, the Harkness table that we have in the classroom. And then I could talk about the instance that I just talked about right there, which is the Harkness table, which is at an individual level. And so this is the difference of genus and species. And typically, philosophers at very least act like, if not actually believe, that all things can be related to genus and species relations. We'll get into that a little bit in the next unit, or the next chapter of this unit, in which we talk about definitions. But for now, it's really just important to recognize that that's what we mean when we talk about categories. Or put another way, when we talk about categories, we're really talking about terms. Well, what is a term? It's really just everything that I talked about right now. This is a term. This is a term. Even this is a term, right? I'm just talking about the things that I'm referring to. These are all individual terms, right? Like that coffee cup. But I could also talk about coffee cups in general. Now, you'll notice that before, when I picked up something and I showed it to you, that was the actual substance of the term. And I'm pointing to it. Well, when I use the word coffee cup, I'm also pointing to it, right? Think about the fact of what I'm doing right now. Right now, I am pushing air out of through my lungs, out of my mouth. I'm closing my mouth off in certain ways. I'm moving my tongue around, and I'm deciding whether or not to actually keep my nasal cavities open throughout different points in the exiting of air from my body. And then I'm using all of that as just a way of referring to things or pointing to things. The sounds that are coming out of my mouth are like big signs. And those signs are directing you at things like the coffee cup or my cell phone or my jacket that I'm wearing right now. Okay, so that's what we mean by terms, whether it's at an individual level, this coffee cup in particular that's sitting to my left, your right if you're watching this video and it's flipped around, or something even more broad than that, like coffee cups in general. Either way, I'm pointing to something with my language. And so that's the distinction between a term and a word. The word is the sign that points back to the term. In categorical logic, we're just simply asking how terms relate to one another. Generally, we see 4 different ways that we can talk about 2 terms, right? And we refer to these with the 2 qualifiers of either it is affirmative or it's negative. Okay, that would be one set of qualifiers, or it's universal and it's particular. You'll see if you're watching the video, I'm already even kind of making the square of oppositions with my hands. The square of opposition should be something that you hopefully remember back fondly to. There's a lot of fun things that you can do with it. We're not going to explore most of them in this class, but I want you to have in mind that we have different sets of statements. Each statement takes 2 different terms or 2 different categories and sets them side by side, saying ways that they are either different or the same. So the very first set of categories are A statements, and we call them A because we have them at the upper right-hand corner, or upper left-hand corner, pardon me, and that's right next to where the word affirmo, if we're using Latin, affirmo. That's right where that is, and so it's right next to the A of the affirmo. Well, these are statements that are universal, they apply to all of them, and they are affirmative. That is, they say something positive about the thing. So it would be all S's, subjects, are P's, predicates. All subjects are predicates. Keep in mind, remember that generally in logic, we're going to use the subject as the first term in the sentence or the proposition, and the predicate as the second term in the proposition. That's all that I mean by that. So when we say all subjects are predicates, that's another way of saying something like all dogs are animals. I'm referring to something about all of one category, dogs, and I'm saying that they fit into another larger category, or at least equally sized category, such as animals. Now, on the other hand of things, I could say something about all of something that's negative, right? Such as no dogs are cats, right? That's still universal. It applies to all dogs, and it even applies to all cats. And it's saying if I have one circle that refers to all dogs, and another circle that refers to all cats, they won't overlap in any way. That's all that I mean by that. Now we can go down to the bottom portion of the square of oppositions, and we can talk about particular things. So we can talk about some dogs. That's something that we could say affirmatively about some dogs. We could say some dogs are Labradors. And similarly, we can move to the negative side of things, and we could say some dogs are not Labradors. Okay, so the first side, we said something positively about dogs, some dogs, and something negatively about some dogs. Now, keep in mind, in these instances, we might actually be saying something that applies to all dogs as well. It's just not specified. So I could also say some dogs are air breathers. Well, that's true of all dogs, as far as we know. That doesn't mean that it's not that particular universal statement. It is. It just happens to also refer to all dogs. And so too, we could also say that some dogs are not cats. That's also true. Now, we could take it further because we happen to know that no dogs are cats, and we could make it what we would refer to as an E statement, or the universal negative statement. But that doesn't mean that it's not also a universal particular statement, because it's true that there are at least one or more dogs that are not cats. Okay? And so that's what we mean by the square of oppositions. Now, in traditional Aristotelian logic, we're generally going to use compare a set of different propositions in a manner known as a syllogism. Now, a syllogism is a type of argument, and it's a type of argument which has three terms, and it braids those terms together such that there are always two terms in two of the premises and two terms in the conclusion, and the two premises, when put together, necessarily yield the conclusion. That was a lot of words. What I mean by that is basically you have two premises, which are propositions. Each premise talks about two of the terms in question, and then the conclusion draws a necessary statement based off of those two terms. What's an example? Let's think of a helpful one. We're going to keep this at what we're going to refer to as a AAA-1 syllogism. By AAA, I mean that it uses three A statements in a row. And by -1, I'm going to explain that in just a minute, but it's basically going to refer to something that is built off of the middle term predicate, first premise, subject predicate, or subject middle term, second premise, and the conclusion is going to be subject predicate. Put a pin in that because we're going to get to that in just a minute. Okay, this type of argument would be something like this. All cats are mammals. All mammals are animals. Therefore, all cats are animals. Now let's visualize what we just did with that argument. I basically said, let's say all cats, this small circle, are in the larger circle of animals. Fair. I think we would agree that this is true. Similarly, all animals are in... Oh, let me back up a little bit because I just messed up there. All cats are in the larger circles of mammals. Similarly, all mammals are in the larger circle of animals. Okay? And so every single mammal is an animal. Every single cat is a mammal. And therefore we know there's no cat that is not an animal. And that's what we just simply refer to as a AAA-1 argument. Let's get down to that -1 section again, because it actually matters the order that I use the terms. Okay? In the argument that I made, I said all cats, let's say term 1, are mammals, term 2. Then I brought mammals down to the next premise and said all mammals are animals. Well, let's imagine if I switched those two in the second premise. I say all cats are mammals. All animals are mammals. Now, does the conclusion follow that therefore all cats are animals? Well, although the conclusion is true, it doesn't necessarily follow from the argument that I'm making here. Why is that the case? Well, because I'm saying that all cats indeed are mammals, but now I'm suggesting that all animals are mammals, and it could be that there are some mammals that are cats and some mammals that are animals. Now that's kind of silly because that's not actually true, right? So it might kind of be funny to think about it in those lines, but the important thing that I want to point to is the order in which you represent your terms matter. We typically recognize that there are 4 ways to represent your terms in a syllogism. It will always be that your conclusion is therefore in some way, whether it's all or no or some are not, your subject is equal to your predicate in some ways. So either all cats are animals or no cats are animals or some cats are not animals. This will be your conclusion. The term that you use as a subject in your conclusion and the term that you use as a predicate in your conclusion will stay what we refer to as the subject term and the predicate term throughout all of the premises that you're making. And so we might have a syllogism in which the first premise has a subject in its subject position, and then a middle term, which is just the other term that you're going to bring up in your premise or in your syllogism. And then the second premise has the predicate in the subject position as well, too. We're moving those around. You don't need to know all of those right now. Hopefully that jogs your memory. We call these the different figures of a syllogism. All you need to know is that if I move a term from one place to another place, it may affect the validity of the argument. And it's just a refresher from what we called Unit 0 of this course. A valid argument is one in which the premises necessarily result in the conclusion. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. A sound argument is where the premises necessarily result in the conclusion and the premises are true. Therefore, the conclusion is true. And so, if we're building a valid argument, we're wanting to make sure that not only are we using the right letters, right, what we refer to as the mood of the argument, whether that's A, E, I, whatever, the types of statements that we're using, and we're also using the right figure, which would be 1, 2, 3, and 4. And that just means where the terms are located in those arguments. Okay, this is a tricky thing to do without a whiteboard, I will say, because a lot of this is visually represented. I would suggest if you need to a refresher on how the figures and the moods and the different types of statements that we can make in traditional categorical Aristotelian syllogisms, come talk to me and we'll work through this in a little bit more detail. The only other things that I'll say right now is when we refer to the schema of an argument, we're just talking about the mood plus the figures. So when I said a AAA-1 argument, that's what we refer to as the schema of the argument. And we are also going to have an important categorization of different types of terms as they're used in arguments, which we're going to say is a term distributive or is it non-distributive? This is important because this is going to be different in contemporary categorical logic. In contemporary categorical logic, we'll get to that next week. In Aristotelian categorical logic, distributed means that by the statement or by the premise of the argument that you're looking at is one of those terms being referred to in its entirety as a category. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, when I say all cats are mammals, I'm referring to every single cat with that premise. Every single one. And so the subject of that premise is going to be distributive. It refers to all of them. If I say no cats are mammals, I'm referring to every single cat and I'm referring to every single mammal. That's confusing because it's a false premise. So let's say no cats are dogs. Well, now I'm referring to all dogs and all cats, and I'm saying out of all the dogs and all the cats, not a single one of them overlaps. So too, when I get to the third premise, I am talking about when I get to the third type of statement, AEI statements, I say some cats are, Siamese. Okay, now I'm not referring to all cats, I'm only referring to some of them. And I'm not even referring to all Siamese. I'm just simply referring to the ones that are cats. In this situation, every single Siamese cat is a cat. But I could say some cats are, swimmers, right? Are they? I don't know. I think we could argue that premise. But presumably, not all swimmers are cats, right? I can swim. You can maybe swim. And you're not a cat, okay? So we're not making a comment about all swimmers, nor are we making a comment about all cats. And so neither of those terms are distributive. Now, the last one is kind of tricky, which are O statements. O statements would be something like, some cats are not swimmers. Now here, we recognize that we're not talking about all cats. We're only talking about some of them. But we are talking about every single thing that is a swimmer. Why? Because we've implicitly said, of all the swimmers, none of them are cats. Okay? And so the predicate of O statements is distributive. That can be a little tricky, but you can actually just memorize those. You can recognize that for A statements, the subject is distributive. For E statements, the subject and the predicate are distributive. For I statements, neither is distributed. And for O statements, the predicate is distributed. So that can be something that you kind of commit to memory. You may also want to commit the various different figures to memory. But We're not going to do that here, again, especially because I don't have a whiteboard, and it's extremely confusing to start talking about letters as they're existing and floating in thin air. Okay, that's a review of Aristotelian categorical logic. And that's the backbone of what we're going to now dive into when we talk about contemporary categorical logic. It's remarkably similar on most accounts, but there are some different strategies that are going to be implemented. Why? I started off this video telling you why. Don't you remember? Why is simply because in contemporary logic, we generally allow for empty sets. So I could talk about something like the present king of France. If you know your geopolitics right now, there is no king of France. There is a president of France. So if I say something like the present king of France, contemporary logic is going to let me do that. Aristotelian logic is suddenly going to explode because you're dividing by 0. Okay? You don't want to do that. That's why we're going to begin moving in this direction. It does not mean that we're going to get rid of all existential arguments. We're going to eventually get into things like existential arguments and whether or not things can be predicated to being. That's a really fun conversation, but we got a ways to go there. So hold on tight. See you in the next lesson.